Welcome to a gripping tale of survival and mystery in the heart of the jungle. Join a group of adventurous friends as they embark on a fishing trip that quickly turns into a fight for their lives. Lost in the dense wilderness, they encounter strange phenomena and terrifying apparitions that threaten to consume them. Will they find their way back to safety? Or will they become victims of the forest's dark secrets? Get ready for a thrilling journey filled with twists and turns that will keep you on the edge of your seat. So, grab your flashlight and hold on tight as we delve into the chilling depths of Lost in the Jungle. Don't forget to share your thoughts in the comments below. And let's start with our story. Approximately 20 years ago, my uncle's friends decided to go hunting and fishing. As always, my uncle was ready to join. But when he returned home and asked for permission to go, my grandmother immediately started screaming. She said, "No, you're absolutely not going there. Never, ever should you even ask for permission to go there. Don't even think about it." My uncle, still a teenager at the time, couldn't understand what had suddenly gotten into my grandmother. He was so angry that he couldn't go with them and went straight to shower and sleep. The next day, he was still furious, not even greeting his friends or wishing them a good time. It was Friday. The boys were planning to cross the river early in the morning with a boat and then walk a bit until they reached the spot where they heard there was plenty of fish. The next morning, his friends left very early. The plan was to fish and hunt all day and return to the boat by 5 p.m. to cross back. My uncle was unreachable all day, and everyone left him alone. He went about his business with a thunderous expression, watched TV, and for the first time in a while, took a nap in the afternoon. He just felt incomplete without any of his friends around. They always hung out at my grandmother's house. My grandmother paid no mind. She remained adamant that he should never, under any circumstances, go to the other side. Around 7 p.m., my uncle reluctantly approached her. He had been civil all day, but now he wanted to go see his friends to hear about their day. He asked Grandma if he could go, and she allowed it. One of the friends' parents owned a shop, which served as the usual meeting spot for the boys. When my uncle arrived there, it looked deserted. He became a bit irritated, thinking the boys had gone out again without him. He entered the shop and asked his friend's mother where the boys were, and she said they hadn't returned yet. My uncle said, "What do you mean they haven't returned? They were supposed to be gone for just the day. There was no plan to stay overnight." Honestly, my uncle didn't know who to be angry with now. Should he be angry at my grandmother for not letting him go, or at his friends, who had decided to camp in the woods without him? Angrily, he drank another cola, smoked a cigarette, and went home. When he arrived home, everyone saw his angry face, but no one asked or said anything. He went straight to bed. The next afternoon, around 6 p.m., he went to his friend's shop again. When he arrived, it was deserted once more. None of the boys were there. He immediately went inside and asked where the boys were. The lady, his friend's mother, said anxiously that the boys still hadn't returned. My uncle was alarmed when he saw the worried look on his friend's mother's face. He asked if something had happened. The lady said she didn't know or hear anything. She had inquired with the other boys' parents, and they had no news either. My uncle pondered what could have happened. Since there were no mobile phones at that time, they couldn't call the boys to see where they were. Some of the parents were angry. They said this would be the boys' last trip because they had crossed the line. The agreement was for them to be gone for just one day, but now 2 days had passed and they hadn't returned. Some were deeply concerned, fearing the boys were lost or if they had enough food. My uncle suggested going to the place where they had crossed. Since the river wasn't very wide there, maybe they could see the boat, or maybe the boys, in case they had lost their boat. The others thought it was a good idea, and some fathers and other friends went along. When they arrived at the spot, it was already 10 p.m. The crossing points were not proper docks, just someone's backyard or an empty lot. In this case, it was an empty lot, and it was very dark. Without a flashlight, they couldn't see anything. Fortunately, one of the men had one, and they used it to walk to the river. It was very dark everywhere, and the men knew it would be difficult to see anything on the other side. They hoped the boys were smart enough to shine their flashlight if they saw light on the other side. The men shone their flashlights along the water for about half an hour, waiting for any sign from the other side. But unfortunately, nothing. Some wanted to rent a boat to cross and search, but others said it was dangerous at that time, and they wouldn't be able to do much in the dark. They decided to go to the police first thing in the morning, and then decide what to do. The next day was already Monday, so the boys had been missing for 2 full days. Early Monday morning, some parents went to the police to file a report. The police said they would see what they could do, but if the parents could find a boat and cross, they could start searching. By the time some men reached the other side, it was already 2 p.m. They searched and called out, but heard or saw nothing. By 5 p.m., it was getting dark, and the men were afraid to continue in the dark. They thought about who would take care of their families if something happened to them, and decided to return together and come back early the next morning to search longer and go deeper into the woods. They would come more prepared with machetes, guns, food, and light. My uncle was now worried too. He missed his friends and was afraid he would never see them again. By now, he had told my grandmother what was going on, and she told him that was precisely why she hadn't given permission. She said the place was dangerous, and strange things always happened there. My late grandfather had a good friend who was a hunter. He lived along the river and crossed every day to go hunting. He sold the wild meat to support his family. Throughout the years, he had experienced a lot, even getting lost a few times. But he believed he had good guardian angels guiding him, allowing him to always find his way back. The fact that he had been crossing over with his father since he was a little boy also played a role. He knew the forest like the back of his hand. My grandfather and he had been longtime friends, and through him, my grandmother knew many stories of the other side of the river. That's why my uncle wasn't allowed to go. Now, he was somewhat relieved he hadn't gone, but on the other hand, he was terribly worried about his friends. Around 10 p.m., the phone rang. It was one of his friends, laughing and shouting into the phone, "Boy, we're back. Come quickly." My uncle shouted with joy. When my grandma asked who it was, he said it was one of his friends and that they were back. He asked if he could go for a bit, knowing my grandma would object since it was already a bit late. So he said a bit, but that bit lasted for 2 hours. My uncle drove at top speed to the shop. He just knew they would all be there. Upon arriving at the shop, he saw a commotion. Everyone was gathered in a circle, and he knew his friends would be in the center, telling their story. He was no longer worried because his friend had laughed on the phone, so he knew nothing serious could have happened. When he finally saw his friends, he was shocked. It was like watching a black and white movie. They looked so dirty, gray, and exhausted. It seemed like all the color had drained from their bodies and clothes, and they looked so emaciated. This was unexpected, and he rushed towards them to embrace them all. He said he was glad they were all back. The reunion was very noisy, as expected with teenagers. They made some jokes about running away from home and now being back, until one of the parents said it was getting late, and the boys needed to bathe and sleep. They needed their rest. My uncle looked at his buddies and agreed, saying they should do just that. My uncle was about to leave when his friend Sergio from the shop grabbed his sleeve and said, "Stay a little longer. While my little brother freshens up, we can chat a bit more." My uncle knew he would now hear everything and gladly stayed. Sergio began to tell the full story of what happened to them in the woods. We were already early with all the preparations, so we could cross over early too. We tied the boat securely and agreed not to wander far from it, because leaving the boat unattended was risky. Someone could take off with it, or with the motor. So, they had to stay alert when they heard motor noises. They entered the forest and chose a spot to store their gear. They wouldn't carry everything around all the time. They only took the nets, a few machetes, and the gun, along with bags to carry their catch or game. They walked to find a spot to fish. Meanwhile, they also kept an eye out for wild game. Suddenly, they saw a big deer grazing not far from them. They all fell silent. Diggy, who was supposed to shoot, prepared his gun and took a shot. Direct hit. He fired 2 more shots to make sure the animal was dead. Then they ran over to see it. The deer was large, and its belly seemed bigger than that of normal deer. Steve said, maybe it was pregnant. The others said, too bad then, but we have some tasty meat now. They put the deer in a bag and carried it until they found a spot to fish. They were already happy and discussed how they would prepare the deer and who would get to eat. If they found more, they would divide it among themselves, but they would prepare this one at the shop tomorrow, and everyone could enjoy it. They joked and chatted, enjoying themselves. The gentlemen were having a good time. By 11 p.m., they hadn't caught much, so they decided to head back to their food, eat, and then try another spot to fish. They did just that. They ate a portion of their food and saved some for later in the afternoon. After spending some time together, eating and drinking, they headed out again. Ronald commented, "Don't you find it quiet today?" The others laughed at him and said, "What do you expect to hear in the forest? Passing cars or music from the radio?" Ronald added, "Okay, we won't hear that. But we don't hear any other animal sounds either, not even the birds. I find it a bit creepy. And I also feel like someone was following us, and just when we were eating, it seemed like someone was watching us. I keep getting chills all over my body." The other boys teased him, calling him a scaredy cat, and decided to try a different direction for fishing. They asked Ronald if he would come along or stay behind out of fear. Of course, he didn't want to stay alone. So they went on. They had hidden their loot. The deer, well under the tree, covered with bags and branches and lots of leaves. It had to stay hidden from people or other animals. They walked for a while and eventually chose a spot to fish. This time, they caught a lot of fish. Each boy had brought a bag and a net. By 4 p.m., all the bags were full. Then they decided to go back to their tree. Upon arrival, they saw everything was just as they had left it. They took out their food and checked to see if the deer was still in its hiding place. It was exactly as they had left it. The scaredy cat from the group had eventually forgotten all the feelings he had because he was happy as the bags began to fill up. Now, they decided to eat all the food and then leave. They were overjoyed with their catch and saw no need to stay longer. Plus, they still had to clean and chop up the deer at home. So there was still a lot of work to do. After they had finished their meal and rested a bit, they tidied up everything neatly. They decided to divide one of the bags of fish among the remaining 5 bags, as one person had to carry the deer. Fortunately, they didn't have to walk far to reach their boat. Once everything was divided and they had agreed on who would carry what, they started walking back. By now, it was getting dusk, and they wanted to reach the riverbank before it got dark. So, they walked fast. After about 15 minutes of walking, they noticed that it was getting darker. After a while longer, it suddenly became pitch dark. Steve said, "Shouldn't we have reached the boat by now? We've been walking for at least half an hour." The others reassured him that it only seemed longer because of the darkness, and they should just keep going. They walked for another 15 minutes when Steve said again, "Something's not right. We shouldn't have walked this long to get to the boat. We must have taken a wrong turn somewhere, leading us in a different direction." Everyone fell silent. They realized they were indeed lost. The youngest in the group piped up with a trembling voice, "What do we do now? We are alone and lost in the woods." Sergio said, "Don't worry, I've been here many times. I'll get us out. Just follow me." The boys started walking again. For what felt like an eternity, they walked. But it was only about an hour when Steve spoke up again. "Guys, we're really lost. There's no point in continuing. We'll only go deeper into the forest instead of getting out." Again, Sergio reassured them, "Don't worry, I'll get us out. Just follow me." And they resumed walking. They walked and walked, but they couldn't reach the riverbank. Occasionally, they took breaks, then continued walking. By now, they were all very scared and tired. Carrying their bounty was becoming increasingly difficult. Eventually, Sergio, growing angry, said, "Listen, if you want to keep walking, go ahead, but I'm not taking another step. We're in complete darkness, not knowing where we're going. It feels like we're walking in circles." Some agreed with him, while others wanted to continue following Sergio. Since Sergio claimed to be familiar with the area, they reluctantly followed him. It was surprising to them because they had never heard Sergio mention going hunting or fishing before. He was more the type to hang out with his friends or a girlfriend if he had one. His relationships never lasted long, but when he did have someone, all his attention went to his sweetheart. Suddenly, Dicky exclaimed, "But where are the flashlights? We've been walking in darkness for so long." And nobody thought of turning on the flashlights. Ronald said, "Dicky, for someone uneducated, you're pretty smart. But couldn't you have come up with that idea earlier?" Everyone chuckled, though some were still frightened. set down everything and began searching for the flashlights. When they found them and tried to turn them on, they didn't work. They tapped them, as one does when a flashlight won't turn on. But still, they remained off. Now they began to get angry with each other, blaming one another for bringing broken things and not checking them at home before coming. They all argued loudly. Two of the boys even wanted to fight each other when they suddenly heard a scream. It sounded like someone was screaming loudly in their direction. For a moment, the boys were silent. But then they started running, screaming in fear. They could feel something coming toward them, and they felt their lives were in danger. And they kept running. Fortunately, they didn't scatter in different directions, but followed each other. So, they ran for a long time, constantly looking back to see if the thing, or whatever it was getting closer. Of course, they couldn't see anything in the pitch-black darkness. They kept running until one by one, they collapsed from exhaustion. Some wanted to keep running, but they couldn't leave their friends behind and decided to stop. They told each other, "Let it come attack us. We'll fight until we die." The youngest in the group began to cry heartbreakingly. All toughness was gone, and he cried to go home, crying for his mother. He told his brother that if he died there, to tell their mom he loved her very much. Some of the other boys began to cry quietly too. It was dark, and no one would see. So, they sat together for a while until Sergio said, "But whatever was chasing us must have also stopped, because with the speed it was coming, it should have reached us by now. Let's make a fire here and wait until it gets light again, and then we'll be able to see better. Then we can find the river faster. And when we're at the river, we'll know which direction to walk to find the boat." The youngest one in the team added, "But first thing tomorrow, we have to find our fish and deer before we search for the river. I'm not leaving those things behind for someone else." The boys laughed again. Though tired, stressed, and hungry, their spirit was not broken. They saw this as an extra adventure and intended to enjoy it. Whatever was chasing them seemed to have gotten lost or found something else. They couldn't make a fire that evening because they had dropped their matches along with the rest of their belongings when they ran away in fear. They decided to sit close together, with some sleeping, while others kept watch. What the boys didn't know was that it was already 5 a.m. After a while, they all fell asleep, one by one. The next morning, they slept longer than they intended. The sun didn't shine through the trees, so nobody realized it was already morning. The boys were also quite exhausted, so they slept until it started to get hot. Only then did Diggy wake up first. He started cursing, waking up the rest of the boys. They asked him what was wrong, and he immediately said, "Look at the sun." They realized it was already late in the morning, or perhaps even afternoon. They hurried to their feet. They couldn't believe they had slept for so long and deeply. They briefly discussed what to do. Everyone suggested searching for their belongings first. They should be able to find their way back easily because it looked like a herd of wild cattle had run through the area. They laughed and joked, speculating about what could have caused it. Each idea was more outlandish than the last, and they laughed and had a great time. They forgot the horror they had experienced the previous night when they found their belongings. Everything was just as they had left it. They checked to see if anything had spoiled, but everything seemed fine. They talked and decided to pick up everything and head back to the boat. But as soon as they took a few steps, they realized this part of the forest was unfamiliar to them. They hadn't walked there the previous day, on their way to the tree where they had left their things. They also couldn't see the tree anywhere. It was a tall tree, so they should have been able to see it if they were nearby. Some of the boys walked around to inspect the area. They all found it strange and unfamiliar, and concluded that they were truly lost now. Everyone looked at Sergio. They asked him where he had brought them. Sergio replied, "What do you mean? I didn't bring you here." When the boys heard this, they were very angry. They started cursing at him, and it became chaotic again. Sergio kept yelling, asking what they were talking about, and if they had gone crazy. It was his first time coming across the river. The boys stared at him in disbelief and grew even angrier. Sergio was of Native American descent and had a light complexion, but now he looked like a tomato. He was also angry and didn't know what his friends were talking about. In his mind, he never told them that he knew this area. Eventually, Diggy said it was pointless to argue now. They had to get moving quickly, or it would be dark again soon, and they still had to find the river. They picked up all their stuff and started walking. Now they no longer followed Sergio, and he walked all the way at the back, still angry. After a while of walking, Sergio became aware of a voice he kept hearing in his head. At first, he thought he was just imagining things because he was so angry, but as he stopped talking to anyone and became more aware of the voice in his head, he could make out what it kept saying. The voice repeated over and over, "They killed my wife and child, so I'll kill them all." This kept repeating in his head for a long time. Eventually, he couldn't think his own thoughts anymore and only thought, "I have to kill them all." This made him angrier and more aggressive. Ronald sensed that something was wrong with Sergio. He began to walk slower and eventually walked beside Sergio. Sergio was breathing heavily. His eyes were red, and he seemed very angry and detached. Ronald tried to calm him down, but Sergio didn't seem to hear him. When Ronald asked him something, Sergio only growled in response. The boys kept walking, but they seemed to never reach their destination. They walked in all directions, but it felt like they were going in circles. The trees all looked the same. Ronald continued to observe Sergio. Instinctively, he knew something was seriously wrong with the boy. This wasn't the normal Sergio who always cracked jokes and laughed. Since Ronald was religious and had experienced certain things before, he first started praying silently. He asked the Almighty Power to help him bring Sergio back. He began to talk calmly to Sergio and kept calling his name. He kept calling Sergio until Sergio finally responded. He asked a few questions to make sure it was really Sergio who was answering, and told him what was happening. Sergio didn't remember much. He knew they had crossed over, killed a deer, and tried to fish, but caught nothing. Beyond that, he didn't remember anything else. Ronald spoke calmly to him and told him not to panic. "Something is seriously wrong here. We've been walking for ages, and there seems to be no end in sight. We can't find the river or the creeks and swamps where we caught all that fish." The other boys had also realized that something was seriously wrong, but they decided to keep walking. They took breaks occasionally and then resumed walking. They had no idea where they were going, but they kept walking. It was starting to get dark again. The boys agreed to keep walking until there was still light, and then they would sit together and wait for it to become light again. So they did. Once they were sitting together, they felt how exhausted and hungry they were. A foul smell was emanating from all the bags by now. They decided to place the bags at a distance and cover them with a few branches. They were doing this when they heard that sound from the previous evening again, coming in their direction. Again, it sounded like someone was screaming and chasing them. The boys screamed in fear and started running again in panic, although they had given up the night before and stopped running. They ran and ran, expecting something terrible at any moment, but nothing happened. The sound just kept getting closer. Eventually, Ronald shouted for them all to stop. Some wanted to keep running, but the bravest decided to stop and fight if necessary. Once they had stopped, the sound started encircling them. It seemed to be coming from all directions. The boys were very scared, and some even wet their pants. They later told each other. Ronald was scared too, but he decided to pray. He kept praying and praying, and eventually he prayed aloud. After reciting a few prayers, he shouted, "Who are you?" The others were silent. Nobody even dared to breathe loudly. There was no answer. Again, Ronald asked, "Who are you?" He had to repeat this several times when Sergio suddenly reacted angrily. "You killed my wife and child. I'll kill all of you." The boys were shocked to hear Sergio's voice. It didn't sound like Sergio at all, and some started cursing at him. Ronald shouted at them to shut up and let Sergio speak. Sergio kept repeating the same thing. "You killed my wife and child. I'll kill all of you." The boys started talking among themselves about what this could mean. What was Sergio talking about? They hadn't killed anyone. They started asking each other if any of them had ever done something like that. They all admitted that this was not the case, but Sergio kept repeating the same thing. Ronald asked the boys to remain quiet and began praying loudly again. He asked the Almighty for help and strength, and meanwhile, he kept calling Sergio's name repeatedly. He kept doing this until Sergio finally responded. He asked him a few questions again to make sure it was really Sergio, and then asked him if he knew what had just happened. Sergio said no. He said he kept seeing a pregnant Native American woman being shot dead. Then she was put in a bag and carried away. That's all he said, and then everyone fell silent. Everyone thought deeply about what that could have been. In the meantime, the buzzing and humming started again around them. The boys were scared, but now remained in one place. They sat close together and talked about everything that was happening to them and when it all started. Suddenly, the little boy remembered that the deer they had shot was full. Could that be related to all of this? Everyone was shocked. After discussing for a while, they concluded that it could only be that and nothing else. They asked Sergio what they should do now. Since he was Native American, they thought he might know what to do in such a situation. Sergio snapped at them that he knew nothing about his culture because he had never been to his village. Now, everyone looked at Ronald. They asked him what they should do now. They took everything very seriously and didn't want to die, as Sergio had repeatedly said. Ronald said there was only one option. They all had to pray and ask for forgiveness for what they had done in ignorance. The boys all began reciting their prayers like never before. Some even begging for forgiveness. They said they were too young to die and pleaded to be forgiven for their ignorance. They tried to pray and beg all evening until they fell asleep. Everyone was asleep except Ronald. He knew it wasn't wise to fall asleep, but he couldn't blame his friends. He knew how exhausted they were. He could barely keep his eyes open himself, but he continued to pray courageously. Now, he prayed for himself and for his friends. Suddenly, he saw a kind of light appear in the distance. Not very bright, but in it, he could see a Native American man standing. He seemed to step out of a story, with headdress and all. Ronald didn't move. He wondered if he was dreaming, or if this was reality, and continued to look at the man. And suddenly, the man spoke to him. He was at a distance, yet Ronald seemed to hear him very clearly. He said, "I now see that you regret what you have done, and I also see how innocent your friends are. Instead of supporting you, they're all sleeping." Ronald began to cry. He said the man should forgive them. They had shot at the deer, not knowing what or who it exactly was. They were very sorry and wanted to do anything to make it right. Only he shouldn't kill them here in such a cruel way. They still had their families at home, and they would never know what had happened to them. The Indian still seemed very angry, but he listened nevertheless. Ronald prayed and pleaded for a while longer, until the Indian started talking again. He said, "You have done what you have done. We can't change that now. I won't get my wife and child back, but you must promise me one thing. Please bury her first thing in the morning." Ronald solemnly promised that he would do so first thing once it became light again. The Indian said nothing more and seemed to dissolve into nothingness again. Not long after, it became light. Ronald immediately woke all the boys up. He said they had to do something right away. The boys were immediately wide awake. Ronald said they had to throw away all the fish and bury the deer immediately. Although the boys were still exhausted, they listened to him. They used their machetes and hands to dig a hole, placed the deer in it, and then covered it up again. Each boy then apologized again for how sorry they were and that they wouldn't take anything from here, but if they could still return home. Once all the boys had said their piece, they started walking again. All this had taken them about 3/4 of the day. Digging a hole by hand is no joke. It had taken a lot of time, but they decided to leave the place immediately. They no longer walked at a fast pace because they were now too tired. Some were simply too weak because they hadn't eaten or drunk anything for so long. So they really walked step by step. Suddenly, one of the boys said, "Look, a red light there in the sky." Everyone was shocked and thought, "What now?" They kept looking at it as they walked. The light didn't seem to move, but was in one place. Steve said, "I think I know what that is. Look carefully. It's a mast. It's the mast of Radio X. So, we're almost at the riverbank." Out of enthusiasm, they started walking faster now. They already knew where they were. If that really was Radio X, then they just had to walk a bit westward at the riverbank, and they would find their boat. The boys started to become happy. They knew they were relieved from the nightmare. After a while, they found their boat. They wanted to laugh and dance, but out of weakness and fear of what they had experienced, they said nothing. They put their boat in the water and started the motor. The motor started on the first try. They now took out their flashlights again Now they had hope that they would turn on again. And indeed, they did. They all turned on one by one. The boys shone their lights in the water, and Diggy cautiously sailed the boat across. Once they reached the other side, they ran to the places where they had hidden their bikes, took them out, and all cycled quickly to the store. Suddenly, they seemed to have gained so much strength and energy, but it was just the adrenaline. When they arrived at the store, they all collapsed. The parents were called, and on the other side, people ran with water and bread for the boys. As the exhausted boys sat in the store, finally safe from the horrors of the jungle, a sense of relief washed over them. They had survived the nightmarish ordeal, and now they could return home to their families. But as they rested, a chilling thought lingered in their minds. What other mysteries lay hidden in the depths of the wilderness? As they exchanged glances, a sudden rustling outside the store caught their attention. With hearts pounding, they turned to the door, half expecting to see the apparition of the vengeful spirit looming in the shadows. But to their relief, it was only the gentle breeze whispering through the trees. Still, the memory of their harrowing experience would stay with them forever, a cautionary tale of the dangers that lurked in the unknown. And as they prepared to leave, Ronald couldn't help but wonder if they had truly escaped unscathed. What do you think of this story? Did it keep you on the edge of your seat? Let us know in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel for new stories every week.